In early summer, sheep are driven into a stone-walled enclosure in the Cotswolds. The shearers force each animal onto the ground and move their iron shears close to its skin. An entire fleece is lifted from the sheep's back and spread across the yard. The cleaner sections with longer fibers are separated from the edges stained with mud, dung, and fragments of vegetation. For the shepherd, this is the year's harvest. For the London merchant, it is only the moment when the raw material leaves the farm. On the 2nd of June, 1480, the London wool merchant Richard Seeley wrote to his son George, who was living in Calais. There was no praise for the Cotswold landscape in his letter. He first confirmed that George had sold 6 large sacks and 1 smaller parcel of middling Cotswold wool to John de Solermer, a merchant from Ghent. Richard then told his son that he had just dispatched another 17 large sacks from London. On the same day, another member of the family had returned from the Cotswolds after purchasing 3,000 wool-bearing sheepskins from the local wool dealer William Midwinter. Richard also instructed George to purchase 500 or 600 pieces of strong canvas in the overseas market for packing the next shipment. One consignment had just been sold. Another had already left London. More wool was being purchased in the countryside. Even the canvas required to wrap it had to be secured in advance from across the channel. That single letter placed the most important structure of the medieval wool trade on one sheet of paper. The sheep grew their fleeces on English farms. The wool was collected in the countryside. London provided capital, weighing, packing, and export administration. Calais provided storage and access to buyers. Merchants from Ghent, Bruges, and other towns in the Low Countries then carried the wool into textile workshops. So how did a medieval wool merchant make money all the way from the farm to the international market? The answer was not simply to buy cheaply from farmers and sell at a higher price to foreigners. The real business was turning small, inconsistent quantities of wool, scattered across hundreds of farms, into a bulk commodity that foreign cloth manufacturers were willing to purchase. The English crown was willing to permit for export, ships could transport, and financiers could settle across several currencies. The Seeley family left behind an unusually complete trail through this commercial chain. During the 1470s, the elder Richard Seeley was a London wool exporter and a member of the Company of the Staple of Calais. His sons were positioned at different points in the business. Some remained in London to manage money and dispatch cargo. Others traveled into the Cotswolds to purchase wool. George lived for long periods in Calais, where he searched for foreign buyers, managed stored cargo, and sent market information back to England. The Sullis were not the wealthiest commercial dynasty in London, but they possessed a well-positioned urban residence, an estate in Essex, and land in several other counties. For them, wool was no longer a sequence of isolated purchases. It had become a long-term commercial system capable of supporting property ownership, family status, and landed wealth. The family did not personally visit every farm and purchase a few fleeces from every individual shepherd. They depended on regional dealers. One of the most important in the Cotswolds was William Midwinter of Northleach. Midwinter was not an ordinary farmer who happened to own several hundred sheep. He collected fleeces and sheepskins from numerous producers across the countryside, assembled them into larger consignments. He knew which estates produced finer wool. He knew which flocks had suffered from disease. He knew which producers urgently needed cash. He also knew which landholders were willing to wait until a later payment date. The Sully family was not merely purchasing the output of a single farm. It was purchasing a producing region that Midwinter had already organized. This layer of middlemen was not unnecessary. Wool production was extremely scattered. An ordinary household might own only a few dozen sheep. Even a relatively large estate might not produce enough wool in one season to fill the kind of export consignment required by a London merchant. Historical research suggests that an adult sheep in medieval England often yielded only around 1.5 to 1 3/5 pounds of wool. A standard export sack contains several hundred pounds. One sack could therefore represent the annual fleeces of more than 200 sheep. Flocks also faced sheep scab, harsh winters, poor nutrition, and high mortality. Actual output changed significantly from year to year. An exporter wishing to prepare dozens of reasonably consistent sacks needed to combine the production of several thousand animals. This was the value of regional dealers such as Midwinter. They performed the first layer of collection, selection, and credit management on behalf of the London merchants, but they also carried cash flow risk. In 1482, Midwinter complained in a letter that the price at which he had sold wool to the Sally family was lower than the cost of replacing it with wool of similar quality. He also complained that he had still not been paid. The wool had already been delivered. The London merchants had not yet completed payment. In another letter, the elder Richard heard that Midwinter had personally come to London to demand the money he was owed. Richard responded with a dry complaint that he hoped to be rid of him quickly. This was not a romantic route of international commerce. The wool had not yet left England, and the credit problems had already begun. From the farmer's side, selling wool to a regional dealer offered clear advantages. The producer did not need to find a textile merchant in Ghent. He did not have to transport his wool to London. He did not need to understand the taxes, currencies, laws, and trading rules of Calais. He could receive money relatively soon after shearing and use it to pay rent, wages, livestock expenses, and the costs of the next agricultural season. The price of that certainty was the surrender of most of the later increase in value. The regional dealer accepted the risk of collection and waiting. The London merchant accepted the risks of export and the foreign market. The overseas wholesaler accepted the risk of converting wool into cloth and selling it again. Every time a fleece moved forward, the nature of the risk changed. The price also increased. Once the wool left the farm, it first had to be sorted. Not all Cotswold wool had the same value. The fibers from a sheep's shoulders, back, belly, and legs could differ in quality. The fleece of a young animal might differ from that of an older sheep. Washed and unwashed wool had different weights. Damp wool appeared heavier. Mud, sand, hair, vegetable matter, and other debris could add false weight to a bale. The company of the stable therefore imposed strict rules on packing and identifying origin. Wool could not lawfully be mixed with soil, sand, or rubbish. Merchants were not supposed to blend wool from different regions and then sell the whole consignment under the name of the more expensive district. The wool was generally supposed to be packed in its county of origin by approved packers. The sacks were inspected, sealed, and marked with their place of origin. On the surface, these regulations prevented fraud. Commercially, they also created a reputation that could be sold internationally. The buyer in Ghent had never seen the sheep. He did not know whether the Cotswolds had received too much rain that year. He could not know how much damp or dirty edge wool had been hidden inside the sack. He was prepared to pay a higher price because the package carried a regional name, a grade, a weight, and the exporter's mark, and because it had supposedly passed through professional inspection. The wool merchant sold more than fiber. He sold assurance about the fiber's identity. A dishonest exporter might profit once by surrounding coarse wool with an attractive outer layer, but the next time, foreign buyers would reduce their offers for all English wool. Professional packers therefore protected the buyer and the reputation of the entire export industry. The existence of rules did not eliminate fraud. The Sealy correspondence mentions packers removing inferior wool and rearranging sacks. It also records foreign buyers accusing English merchants of mixing new and old wool, washed and unwashed wool, or mislabeling its region of origin. The neater a wool sack looked from the outside, the harder it was to see what had been placed in the middle. That gave the merchant room to create profit. It also gave him the opportunity to destroy his own reputation. After grading, the wool was compressed into strong canvas packaging. The elder Richard's request that George purchase hundreds of pieces of canvas of the correct width shows that packaging materials, the cloth needed to be strong enough to survive long-distance road transport, dockside handling, seawater, and warehouse storage. Once the sack was sewn shut, the merchant's mark was added. From that moment, the wool inside no longer belonged commercially to one sheep or one farm. It had become Sealy family inventory. The consignment then had to travel from the Cotswolds to a port. The Sellis's wool was probably carried by packhorse along old roads across southern England and into London or smaller ports in Kent and Essex. Their correspondence shows that wool ships did not sail only from the largest harbors. Maidstone, New Hythe, Millhall, London, Colchester, and other small ports participated in traffic across the Channel to Calais. Medieval international trade was not conducted through one enormous centralized terminal. Dozens of ports that now appear minor helped move English wool overseas. If the cargo passed through London, it had to be weighed at an appointed location so that customs and subsidy payments could be calculated. Sealy wool in London was weighed around late. Once the weight had been confirmed, the crown took its share before the foreign buyer received anything. From the late 13th century, the English monarchy imposed a fixed customs charge on every sack of wool exported. The original ancient custom was 6 shillings and 8 pence per sack. Temporary and long-term subsidies were later added. During parts of the 14th century, the combined customs and subsidy charge reached 40 shillings per sack, or £2. For lower-priced wool, the tax could consume 3/10, 1/2, or even more of its domestic value, because the charge was assessed largely by the sack rather than perfectly by value. Lower-quality wool carried an especially heavy relative burden. By the later 15th century, when the stylists were trading, the rates and exact forms of collection had changed many times. Taxation still remained one of the largest costs in the transaction. Their letters and accounts mention customs and subsidy debts of more than £93 in one case and around £75 in another. This was not the fee of 1 or 2 dock workers. A single tax obligation could equal the annual income of a small estate. Sometimes the company of the staple paid the government on behalf of its members and then collected the amounts from individual merchants. The exporter could therefore owe a substantial tax bill before the wool had been sold abroad. Why did the crown concentrate the trade so tightly? Because wool was more than a commodity. It was a fiscal instrument. By forcing exports through approved ports and through Calais, the government could more easily count the wool leaving England and collect duties from it. The garrison at Calais needed wages. The monarchy needed money for war. Silver and gold paid by foreign buyers could also enter the monetary system surrounding Calais. The wool cut from sheep in English pastures eventually became soldiers' pay. The medieval wool merchant did not operate in a free market beyond the reach of the state. One of his central functions was to convert foreign demand into taxable royal revenue. Once the cargo had been weighed, taxed, and documented, it could be loaded onto a ship. Sealy accounts repeatedly record freight of approximately 6 shillings and 8 pence for carrying one large wool sack to Calais, with additional handling and crew charges. For one sack, the figure did not appear overwhelming. Across dozens of sacks, combined with inland transport, packing, storage, and staff expenses, the costs accumulated quickly. The channel crossing was short. It was not free of risk. Unfavorable winds could trap vessels in port. The appearance of hostile ships could force the entire wool fleet to wait for protection. The Selly correspondence mentions English ships being chased near Calais by French vessels. Others encountered Scottish ships between Dover and Calais. One vessel that should have delivered wool to Calais was forced to throw its entire cargo into the sea. Wool did not dissolve immediately in seawater like salt, but once soaked, it became heavier, dirtier, and difficult to process. Even when the ship survived, a consignment of premium export wool could become damaged stock that had to be sold at a discount. After reaching Calais, the wool entered the staple warehouses. Calais was not merely a port, it was the institutional center of the English wool export system. From the later 14th century through much of the 15th, high-quality English raw wool was generally required to pass through Calais, where its sale was controlled by the company of the staple. The company possessed its own mayor, court, officials, and trading regulations. As members, the Sellers had a right that ordinary farmers and regional dealers did not possess: legal access to wholesale buyers from Flanders, Brabant, Spain, and other European regions. This was the importance of George Sealy's residence in Calais. His job was not simply to stand on the quay waiting for his father's ship. He had to check whether every sack had arrived. He arranged repacking. He confirmed warehouse space. He watched which foreign merchants had entered the town. He judged which buyers could pay immediately, which ones required credit, and which ones were merely attempting to force down the price. He then wrote the information back to London. The elder Richard complained when his son wrote too little and demanded regular reports about markets and politics. This was not simply a father asking about his son's daily life. Once a large amount of money had been converted into wool sitting in a Calais warehouse, war, embargoes, exchange rates, and the arrival or absence of foreign buyers determined whether the family could pay William Midwinter. The Sellers usually sold to merchants from Flanders and other European regions. Those buyers carried the wool to Ghent, Mechelen, Bruges, Antwerp, and other textile centers, where it was delivered to cloth producers. English wool was expensive not because Europe had no sheep. It was expensive because some English districts produced fiber suitable for high-quality cloth. The foreign textile merchant was purchasing fineness, length, elasticity, and the eventual selling price of the finished fabric. A sack of superior wool could support the production of expensive cloth. A sack of coarse wool could enter only a cheaper product. The regional name therefore had real financial value in Calais. In 1480, the elder Richard learned that one sack of high-quality Cotswold wool had sold for 19 marks, while 6 sacks of middling wool achieved only 13 marks each. Within the same family, the same warehouse, and the same market, quality grading created a price difference of almost 1/2. The first way the wool merchant earned money was therefore through the quality spread. He needed to judge, earlier than the foreign buyer, which commercial grade a fleece purchased in the countryside would eventually achieve. If Midwinter sold a consignment as ordinary wool and the Sellers believed careful sorting could raise it into a better grade, the exporter could capture the additional value. If they judged incorrectly and expensive wool had to be downgraded in Calais, they carried the loss. The second source of profit was scale. A farmer selling several dozen fleeces had little ability to negotiate with an international cloth manufacturer. Once the Sellers combined thousands of fleeces into dozens of standard sacks, they could satisfy the needs of a large buyer in one transaction. The buyer no longer needed to visit 200 farms. He only needed to inspect the goods in the Sealy warehouse at Calais. The exporter reduced the buyer's acquisition costs and kept part of that saved expense as profit. The third source was time. Farmers produced most of their wool during the shearing season. Supply was concentrated, and prices could come under pressure. An exporter could store wool in London or Calais and wait for foreign buyers to arrive. Waiting was not free. Warehouses required payment, taxes, and supplier debts already existed. Wool absorbed moisture. Older stock could gradually become less attractive. The Calais staplers even required buyers, in some circumstances, to accept 3 consignments of new wool together with one of old wool when making larger purchases. The rule itself reveals that unsold old wool in the warehouses was a real commercial problem. The fourth source of profit was credit. Foreign buyers did not always pay the entire amount in coin on the day of the sale. Some transactions used precious metal, some used foreign currencies, some were settled through delayed payment and bills of exchange. The family members in London often had to wait for the Calais agent to collect money before they could pay the Cotswold suppliers. The sequence of finance could therefore look like this. The farmer delivered the wool first. The regional dealer agreed to receive payment later. The London merchant paid for packing, transport, and taxation. The Calais agent then sold on credit to a foreign buyer. The foreign buyer might need to sell finished cloth before he could settle part of his debt. The wool had already traveled from the sheep's back to the textile city. The original supplier might still be waiting for payment. The Sealy letters repeatedly show London depending on money sent back from Calais to pay the Cotswold wool dealers. When the foreign buyer delayed, Midwinter came to London to demand what he was owed. The fifth source of profit was currency exchange. The wool might be priced in English pounds but paid for with Flemish money, French coin, bullion, or other forms of value. The saleist had to judge exchange rates. A transaction that appeared profitable in Calais could produce a smaller return after being converted into money usable in England. If the family urgently needed cash, it might have to accept an unfavorable exchange rate. If another English merchant intended to purchase cloth in Flanders, the two sides could use bills of exchange or offsetting obligations to turn overseas balances into funds usable in London. During the later 1480s, fewer English merchants traveled to the Low Countries to purchase goods. The Selly family found it more difficult and expensive to transfer money from Calais back to London. Selling the wool did not mean that the profit had returned home. We can now place 20 sacks of Cotswold wool into a representative model. This is not a complete annual profit statement from the Selly family. Their actual transactions involve different grades, units, currencies, and payment terms. The model simply reconstructs the order in which money was committed as one consignment moved from the countryside to Calais. Suppose one sack of high or upper middle Cotswold wool costs £8 in England. Historical price evidence suggests that, during the middle of the 15th century, the value of different grades of Cotswold wool could range from a little over £5 to more than £8 and 13 shillings per sack. The purchase cost of 20 sacks would therefore be £160. Transport from the farm to the port, grading, packing, weighing, customs, subsidies, and shipment to Calais might add another £3 per sack. Some historical estimates place the combined late medieval cost of packing, transport, taxation, and other export expenses at approximately £3, 6 shillings, and 8 pence per sack. To keep the model simple, we will use £3. 20 sacks add £60. By the time the wool enters a warehouse in Calais, the merchant has committed £220. In a strong year, supplies of Cotswold wool are limited. Buyers from Ghent and Mechlin compete actively. Political conditions remain stable. The wool sells quickly. Suppose the average selling price is £13 per sack. 20 sacks generate £260. The apparent trading spread is £40. Calais storage. The agent's living and employment costs, financial settlement, currency exchange, and small bad debts consume another £10. The final operating surplus is £30. Compared with the £220 tied up in the transaction, the return is approximately 13 or 14%. This is a good trade. It does not double the merchant's capital. Wealth must be created through repeated transactions and larger scale. In an ordinary year, the number of foreign buyers is unexceptional. Some wool has to wait in storage. The average selling price reaches only £12 per sack. Total revenue is £240. Purchase, transport, and export have already consumed £220. Storage, credit, and exchange absorb another 10. Only £10 remain. 20 sacks of wool have crossed the quay. The total sales value reaches several £100s. From outside, it looks like a major international transaction. In the account book, the merchant has locked up more than £200 for months, carried rural purchasing, shipping, and credit risk, and finally received a cash return of less than 5%. In a weak year, the result reverses. Suppose political unrest breaks out in Flanders, foreign buyers delay their arrival in Calais, English wool faces stronger competition from other regions, the average selling price falls to £10 and 10 shillings per sack. 20 sacks generate £210. The cargo had already cost $220 before entering storage. Warehousing and financing expenses continue to accumulate. The consignment may produce a loss of more than £20. The greater danger is that the merchant may refuse to accept the lower price. The wool remains in the account book and still appears to possess substantial value, but But midwinter is waiting for payment. The royal duties have already been paid. The ship owner has already collected freight. The employees in Calais still need food and wages. The profit has not disappeared in one dramatic event. It has simply failed to become coin that can settle existing debts. These three scenarios use the same 20 sacks. The farm purchase price is unchanged. The taxation structure is unchanged. The transport route is unchanged. Only the foreign market price and the speed of sale have changed. This is the greatest difference between the income of the wool merchant and that of the farmer. The farmer primarily carries production risk. Will the sheep survive until shearing? How much wool will each animal produce? Is there enough winter fodder? The exporter primarily carries market and financing risk. Will the wool be graded correctly? Will it arrive in Calais on time? Will foreign buyers appear? Will the exchange rate remain favorable? Will the buyer pay on schedule? After the farmer sells, he usually does not share in the higher price achieved in Calais. But if the foreign market collapses, he also does not personally carry the loss on 20 sacks sitting in a warehouse. The exporter earns whatever remains after accepting those additional risks. Exporters could also push risk back down the chain. They could delay payment to the regional dealer. They could reduce the next season's purchase price when the market weakened. They could require farmers to supply cleaner and more uniform wool. When taxes increased, merchants did not necessarily absorb the full burden themselves. They tried to purchase more cheaply. A royal tax imposed on the exporter could therefore reduce the price ultimately received by the producer. Every layer attempted to move part of its cost backward or forward. The farmer pushed it toward the dealer. The dealer pushed it toward the London merchant. The London merchant pushed it toward the foreign buyer. The foreign cloth producer placed it inside the price of finished textiles. The final purchaser of an expensive piece of cloth paid for sheep raising, shearing, grading, inland transport, packing, customs duties, shipping, storage, credit, weaving, finishing, dyeing, and retailing. Because of Flemish cloth appeared to have been created in a textile workshop. Its costs had begun accumulating on a Cotswold farm. The Seeley family did not become prosperous through one astonishingly profitable transaction. They relied on scale, repetition, family specialization, and access to the international market. Early editors of the family papers noted that the Salis claimed to conduct around 2,000 pounds of trade in a year. Using an estimated commercial return of approximately 10%, historians suggested that two of the brothers might have earned around 200 pounds from their operations. This was a representative historical estimate, not a modern audited net profit figure. It still had to cover family labor, travel, warehouses, property costs, and debts that might never be collected. But 200 pounds could support a high standard of living and help the family continue purchasing land. 30 pounds left by one wool sale could finance the next consignment. It could also purchase houses, land, or shares in ships. Wool absorbed moisture. Its price could fall. It could be thrown into the sea. Land and London property produced more durable income and social standing. The successful wool merchant did not aim to own an ever-growing quantity of wool forever. He attempted to convert unstable trading margins into assets that no longer depended entirely on the next shearing season. By the later 15th century, when the Salis were active, raw wool exports were no longer at their greatest height. England's domestic textile industry was expanding. By the 1430s, exports of finished cloth had overtaken exports of raw wool. An increasing proportion of English wool was spun, woven, finished, and then exported from English towns and rural districts rather than being sent directly to Flanders. Finished cloth allowed more processing income to remain inside England. It also weakened the older trade built around exporting raw wool through Calais. The Seeley family was not operating on a permanently expanding golden route. It was competing for the remaining margins in a trade burdened by heavy taxation, changing foreign demand, and long-term contraction. In 1480, the elder Richard wrote that Lombard merchants had already purchased so much Cotswold wool in England that he had obtained almost no new stock that year. At the same time, a considerable quantity of his family's wool remained unsold in Calais. Competitors had taken the countryside supply. The overseas inventory had not yet turned into cash. Richard could only write that he hoped God would grant them a good sale. That sentence comes closer to the merchant's real position than any grand description of England's wool wealth. His warehouse contained valuable goods. There were buyers overseas. His family possessed the right to trade. But until those buyers actually paid, he could not know whether the wool had created profit or merely the next letter demanding settlement. So how did the medieval wool merchant make money from the farm to the international market? He first gathered the scattered production of hundreds of farmers. Through regional dealers, professional packers, and recognized regional grades, he converted inconsistent fleeces into standardized commodities. He organized inland transport, packaging, weighing, taxation, and sea freight. He carried the wool into the Calais market, which ordinary producers could not enter directly. There, he used warehousing, credit currency exchange, and relationships with foreign buyers to sell the wool to European textile merchants. The farmer received an earlier and more certain price. The regional dealer earned a margin for collection and organization. Packers, carriers, and ship owners received payment for services. The crown collected customs revenue that depended only partially on whether the merchant ultimately made a profit. The foreign buyer obtained the raw material needed to produce expensive cloth. The wool merchant received whatever remained after everyone else had taken their part. That remainder could be substantial. It could amount only to payment for an entire year of family work. It could also disappear completely when a fleece left the sheep's back. It was an agricultural product. After it entered a Sally wool sack, it acquired an origin, grade, weight, mark, export license, and international credit history. The merchant did not earn money from the value that simply grew on the sheep. He earned money by turning the output of hundreds of farms into a transaction that one foreign buyer could complete at once.